Okay, let's jump right in. What if I told you that rules-based globalization, the free trade system we've all sort of known for decades, what if it's actually over, done,
Mm.
and that we're now entering a totally new phase, one that's much more, well, arbitrary, protectionist, and maybe even, frankly, a bit dangerous?
It's a big statement, yeah. But I think the evidence we're going to dig into today really points towards a fundamental shift, and maybe an irreversible one.
Right.
So our mission here is to really unpack why this is happening. We'll trace it back, look at some key historical moments, right up to what's going on now.
The goal being.
The goal is to really get our heads around this new world order that the U.S. seems to be building, and probably most importantly, what it actually means for you listening right now.
And here's something fascinating from our sources, this idea that President Trump's, let's say, extreme tariff decisions, they didn't just spring out of thin air.
No, not at all.
Apparently, they have these surprising roots going back 24 years to what's being called a mistake made by President Bill Clinton.
Right. And the key thing isn't just, oh, look, a historical link. It's how a strategic move, which seemed logical in the Cold War context, sort of unintentionally paved the way for the very economic situation the U.S. is now trying so hard to reverse.
Okay, so how did that happen? Let's connect those dots.
Well, first, we need to remember that the way the world works isn't, natural. It doesn't just happen. It's what we call a world order, a direction set, really pushed by the most powerful countries.
And for decades, that direction was globalization. It shaped everything, right? From the stuff you buy, the phone in your pocket, maybe even the movies you watch.
Absolutely. And to understand where we might be going, we really, really need to look back. Think about after World War I, 1918.
Okay.
People hoped for peace, obviously, but the Treaty of Versailles, it absolutely crushed Germany with penalties. Combine that with the U.S. putting up high tariffs to protect its own industries. It just devastated the German economy. And that economic ruin, well, became a critical trigger, didn't it, for the rise of extremist politics, Hitler, and ultimately World War II.
So the lesson was, don't be too harsh economically.
That seems to be the big takeaway humanity learned, or at least should have learned. Avoid those kinds of crushing punishments.
Okay, so fast forward to after World War II. A different approach then.
Completely different. Germany, Japan, they weren't severely punished in the same way. Instead, the U.S., which was now clearly the top superpower, saw this huge opportunity. They realized stability needed something else.
A new plan.
Exactly. They actively decided to build a new world order, fundamentally different from what led to the war.
And they built it on, what, 4 main pillars? All coming out of that Bretton Woods conference in 1944, U.S. and U.K. leading.
That's the one. So first you've got the United Nations, the UN. It started with big political goals, but pretty quickly settled into more of a peacekeeping role, observing, mediating.
Right.
And second was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (CHAE) that later turned into the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Ah, okay.
Its main job. Simple, really.
Yeah.
Cut tariffs, reduce trade barriers, just get global commerce flowing more freely.
Makes sense. Pillar 3.
The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, its task was global financial stability. And the way it worked originally was, pretty clever.
Yeah.
National currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself was fixed to gold, $35 an ounce. If a country wanted to devalue its currency, make its exports cheaper, they actually needed the IMF's permission.
Wow, take control.
Very. And the fourth pillar was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD. We know it today as the World Bank.
Right. Started focused on Europe.
Yeah, initially just funding Europe's post-war rebuilding. But then in the 50s, its focus broadened out to supporting industrial projects in developing countries all over the world.
And this whole system, this Bretton Woods post-WWII system, it worked.
Oh, what worked spectacularly well for a long time. International trade, investment, they just exploded. Led to huge economic growth in many, many countries, an era of, unprecedented connection.
But there's always a but, isn't there? This massive growth created a problem for the U.S., ironically.
Exactly. It led to this issue of dollar illiquidity. Basically, there were just so many U.S. dollars floating around the globe. By the 1960s, people started asking, wait a minute, does the U.S. actually have enough gold in Fort Knox to back all these dollars if everyone wanted to cash them in?
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it was like a ticking clock under the whole system.
So what happened? Nixon?
Yep, 1971. President Nixon makes this incredibly sudden unilateral move. He just cuts the dollar's link to gold. Poof, Gone.
Just like that.
Just like that. End of the fixed exchange rates, start of the floating system we have today. A massive change.
Why didn't other countries kick up more of a fuss? I mean, that's huge.
Well, they might have been annoyed, sure, but objecting, what could they do, really?
How so?
Two big reasons. One, the U.S. was the superpower, unchallenged, really.
Uh-huh.
Two, almost every country held enormous amounts of U.S. dollars or U.S. government bonds. If they refused to go along, their own reserves would become worthless. Financial suicide.
Ah, okay. They were stuck.
Pretty much. So from that moment, the dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore. It was backed by, well, trust.
Yeah.
Trust in the U.S. economy, its stability. A totally different foundation.
And that sets the stage for this paradox. The U.S., the architect of it all, starts to doubt its own creation. It starts seeing itself as losing.
Exactly. It's a strange turn, isn't it? Dr. Sanathan Satyananthi, an economist who tracks this stuff, he explains it as the U.S. shifting roles from being the world's great producer
to the world's great consumer.
Right. Focusing production mainly on specialized things like high-tech, finance, leaving the basic manufacturing to others.
And who stepped into that manufacturing gap?
Well, first Japan, then the four Asian tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and then the really big one, China.
Right. And you mentioned a kind of wake-up call moment for Americans, the Beijing Olympics.
Yeah, 2008, that opening ceremony, especially that massive synchronized drum performance, thousands of drummers. It was stunning.
I remember that.
For many Americans watching, it was apparently this sudden realization of just how far China had come, often way beyond what they'd assumed. And when they looked back at their own situation, maybe things didn't look so rosy.
And the numbers back that feeling up.
Oh, absolutely. Post-WWII, the U.S. was, 40% of the global economy? Huge by 2023, down to about 26%.
Significant drop.
And China, now the world's biggest exporter, overtaking the U.S. Even in high-tech, where the U.S. used to dominate, it's now running a deficit. There's that Australian study.
Right, the ASPI one.
Yeah, finding China leads in something like 37 out of 44 critical technologies. The U.S. only leads in 7. That's a major shift.
And this isn't just abstract numbers. This hits people, right? Jobs, communities.
Definitely. Old industrial heartlands in the U.S. became known as the Rust Belt. Factories closed, moved overseas. The idea was that new, high-paying future jobs would replace them.
But they didn't always materialize.
Not for everyone, no. Especially for workers without college degrees. Wages basically stagnated for decades. And then came the China shock. Floods of cheap Chinese imports hitting the U.S. market, which studies show led to millions more manufacturing job losses. So you can see why people might feel like globalization wasn't working for them.
Yeah, you can imagine if you see local shops closing because they can't compete, or, essential medicines suddenly being hard to get because the supply chain starts overseas. That feeling of vulnerability, it makes sense.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that some of these current tensions actually have roots way back in the Cold War. Remember, after the Communist Revolution in China in '49, the U.S. and China basically had no relationship for decades.
Right. Total freeze.
But then in the '70s, things started to thaw. You had ping-pong diplomacy.
The table tennis teams, yeah?
Kissinger's secret trip. Then Nixon's huge visit in '72. The big idea was strategic. Pull China closer to counterbalance the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And slowly, China started opening its economy. Late '80s, early '90s.
Okay, so that's the geopolitical backdrop. Then comes 2001, and President Clinton makes this move that, in hindsight, is seen as, well, a mistake. Supporting China joining the WTO.
Right. And the thinking then, the bet, was pretty clear. As China's economy grows, integrates with the world, it'll naturally become more democratic. It'll become an ally, maybe like Japan did after the war.
A reasonable assumption at the time, perhaps?
Perhaps, but it turned out to be, well, completely wrong.
What happened instead?
China's economy absolutely exploded, yes. It wove itself incredibly deeply into the global system, but it didn't democratize at all. And now the whole world, including countries like yours listening, are incredibly reliant on Chinese manufacturing. Just look around you. Made in China is everywhere.
And the key difference here, compared to the old Cold War rival, the Soviet Union.
Ah, that's crucial.
Yeah.
The USSR was a political superpower, a military threat. But economically, not really. Nobody was buying Soviet cars or TVs.
Right.
China's completely different. It became this immense economic superpower, changing the whole global game in a way the old system just wasn't designed for.
So this new kind of rival emerges, built partly on a system the U.S. created, and the U.S. starts to feel threatened, vulnerable.
Exactly. Globalization started to look less like a guaranteed win for America. And that's when the Trump administration came in and basically said, okay, time to tear down this old order.
How did they signal that?
Pretty clearly. Pulling out of organizations like the WHO, suspending funding for the WTO, even making noises about potentially leaving the IMF. It was a clear message. The old rules don't apply anymore.
But these weren't just random acts of disruption, were they? There was a strategy. Dr. Supavud Saichua outlines three main drivers.
Yes, three core strategic reasons behind these actions. The first, and maybe the most fundamental, is economic security and national defense.
Meaning bringing industries back home.
Exactly. Repatriating critical industries. We're talking steel, aluminum, cars, but especially the high-tech stuff, AI, semiconductors. These are seen as vital not just for economic health, but for military capability, too.
And that ties into fixing those supply chain weaknesses we talked about, like the rare earths.
Precisely. The U.S. realized, wait, China controls most of the world's rare earths, needed for our most advanced weapons like F-35s.
Yeah.
That's a huge vulnerability.
90% of the processing, you said?
90%. And it's not just military hardware. Think about medicines.
Yeah.
Over half the core ingredients, the APIs for U.S. drugs, come from China. That's a massive public health security risk in a crisis.
So for the U.S., this became about sovereignty. Economic and national security rolled into one.
Absolutely. Okay, second reason. Balanced trade.
The trade deficits.
Yeah. The Trump view was basically, these deficits mean other countries are ripping us off, taking advantage.
And the solution?
Tariffs.
Tariffs. Big ones. Our sources mention April 2nd, 2025. As a key date, a minimum 10% tariff slapped on all imports. Plus extra tariffs for countries the U.S. runs a deficit with.
That really goes against the whole WTO philosophy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That most favored nation idea. Completely challenges it. MFN basically says you treat all your trading partners equally. These tariffs say, nope, we're treating you based on whether we think the trade is fair to us. It's a direct rejection of that multilateral principle.
Okay, and the third reason?
Financial system control. Basically, the U.S. wants fewer U.S. dollars held overseas. They see it as a burden. They have to pay interest on all those bonds foreigners hold.
So reduce the debt held abroad.
Right. And if other countries are going to hold dollars, the U.S. wants it to be on stricter terms, like maybe forcing them to buy long-term bonds they can't just dump quickly if there's a panic. It's all about protecting U.S. financial stability and maintaining control.
So taken together, these actions are a massive signal.
A huge signal to the world. Those easy, predictable, sweet days of globalization, they're done. America is redrawing the map, changing the rules. And Dr. Supavud emphasizes this isn't a temporary blip. It's a fundamental long-term shift in U.S. thinking. We shouldn't expect things to just snap back to how they were.
Okay, so if the old way is gone and the U.S. isn't going back, what does the future actually look like? Dr. Santithan sketches out three possible scenarios.
Yeah, three ways this could go. Scenario one is extreme isolation, a really closed-off world. Big walls, metaphorically speaking, on trade, finance, tech, even travel, international students. Everything gets harder, more restricted.
Sounds pretty bleak. What's scenario two?
Scenario two is maybe more optimistic, but probably less likely. It's the idea that, okay, the U.S. pulls back, puts up its walls, but the rest of the world just carries on globalizing like before.
But given U.S. influence, that seems tough.
Very tough. Which leads to the third scenario, which Dr. Santithan thinks is the most probable, a mixed and challenging reality. Kind of a messy blend of the first two.
Okay, what does that mixed reality mean in practice for trade?
For trade, it means risk becomes key. Relying on just one country, like China, for cheap parts or materials. Too risky now. So supply chains have to diversify, spread the risk.
Which probably means things get more expensive for us consumers.
Almost certainly, yeah. Higher costs. And it also means market fragmentation. The world probably splits into, say, three big economic blocks.
Which are?
You'd have the U.S. block, the China block, and then this third group, maybe called non-U.S. China or N.U.S. China. That would include places like Southeast Asia, India, Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa.
And for countries in that third block, like maybe where many of our listeners are.
It means intense competition. You'll be fighting harder to sell your goods into other markets within that N.U.S. China block. And at the same time, you'll see more goods from more different countries competing right there in your own home market.
Okay, what about finance in this mixed world? The dollar.
Finance is interesting. The U.S. dollar will almost certainly stay dominant for a while. But, and this is new, experts at the IMF are actually starting to express doubts about its unchallenged status. Not predicting a collapse, but
That's just shit.
a definite trend towards diversifying risk, holding more gold, maybe other currencies alongside the dollar, just not putting all the eggs in the dollar basket anymore.
And finally, technology.
Technology might see that split we talked about, maybe a U.S. tech system and a Chinese tech system that don't easily talk to each other, think different standards, different apps. But crucially, data and innovation will still flow, probably finding new paths through that third and U.S.-China bloc.
Wow. Okay. So putting it all together.
We are definitely undeniably living through a major historical shift. The world order we grew up with, it's being taken apart, and something new is being built piece by piece. It's a fundamental change in global power, in how economies connect.
So the big question we have to leave everyone with is, what does this mean for you, for your country, your business, your future? How do you adapt? How do you rethink your strategy to not just survive, but hopefully thrive in this much more unpredictable global landscape?
That really is the question for our time, isn't it?